Welcome back to the ChessDoofus YouTube channel. My name is Coach Dennis, and I know it's been a very long time since I posted anything here on YouTube, but I'm hoping this year to use this channel a bit more often to post instructive chess content. And today, I'm starting out with something that I think should be very helpful to many players out there of all different levels: how to play with the black pieces against the dreaded London system, the infamous setup for white beginning with d4 and then a very early bishop to f4. Now, I don't really think that there's any one best way to fight against the London. There are a lot of different possible approaches which are all reasonable, and it depends heavily on your own repertoire and your own strengths and weaknesses and tastes. So in today's video, I'm going to give you a set of 5 different ways to play against the London system, and hopefully at least one of them will be the right one for you. Before doing that, I want to briefly talk a little bit more about what the London system is. The London system, as mentioned previously, begins most often with 1d4, and the idea is to bring this bishop out to f4 early. So white could play 1d4 and 2 bishop f4, or white could play 2 knight f3 first and then 3 bishop f4. This would also lead to a London. And usually, soon after white plays bishop f4, white then plays e3, closing the pawn chain and preparing to develop the other bishop. Now, this is where play can start to vary a bit. Most of the time, white's pawn on c2 goes to c3, but there are exceptions. And much of the time, white's knight on b1 goes to d2, but again, sometimes it goes elsewhere. It might go to c3 if white played c4 earlier, for instance. And then there's the light bishop, which could go to e2 or b5, but most often finds activity on d3, where it can see both sides of the board. And one more move that white sometimes throws in, apart from castling of course, is h2 to h3, which gives this bishop on f4 a retreat square on h2. In the last decade or so, another interpretation of the London has gained a bit of a cult following, and that is the Jobava London, which usually starts with 1d4, then 2 knight c3, followed by 3 bishop f4, or maybe the other way around, maybe bishop f4, then knight c3. And this I consider to be a separate opening from the classical London. It really has a lot of its own character and its own themes. So apart from a couple transpositional situations, I really won't be talking about the Jobava much in this video. But if there's interest, maybe I could do a future project discussing how to face this version of the London. So if that's something that might help you, let me know, and perhaps I can add that to the list. One last thing before I get to the first recommendation against the London system. In the description of this video, there's going to be a link to a Lichess study. And that Lichess study has all the information that you're about to see, just in a different format. So if you want the PGN, if you want to analyze with the database or the computer, that would be the place to go. You don't even need to be logged in. It's free for anyone to access. So hopefully that will help you. And apart from that, I think we're pretty much ready to get into my 5 recommendations to face the London system. My first proposed setup is what I will call the classical, and that's because it's the most commonly recommended, most straightforward path against the London. It's a d5 based setup, but black also achieves a very early c5 break, and the knights come to f6 and c6 in the first few moves as well. Here's the most common way of reaching the classical. White starts with d4, black goes d5, and let's say 2 knight f3, although I will come back to 2 bishop f4 in a little bit. Here I would recommend for black to play knight f6. And the reason is that it's the most flexible. You haven't committed to any pawn moves, so if white turns around and plays c4 here, not going for a London, black is ready to transpose into the Queen's Gambit accepted, the Queen's Gambit declined, or the Slav, depending on preference. If instead white plays bishop f4, then we can go with c5. And I really don't think that most London players will take this pawn, but if they do, just know that there are several ways for black to get it back quickly, and the best one is probably e6, meeting b4 with a5 to undermine the pawns, and black is perhaps already better. So white plays e3, and now knight c6 leads to our classical setup. So this is going to be our first starting position of sorts. We're going to come back to this position several times. The old main move for white here is c3, and black has at least two strong ideas here that you should remember. The first is knight h5, chasing down this annoying bishop on f4, and the other, the more common one, is the main line here, queen b6, which targets the undefended pawn on b2. Remember those two ideas, and you'll be in good shape. Now, playing b3 would be very weakening to many of the dark squares, and also queen c1 would be a very passive move. So historically, the main move for white here was queen b3, hoping that we will trade queens and open their rook on a1. But black instead plays c4, hoping that white will trade queens and open our rook on a8. And after that, we would also have this powerful plan of b5, b4, creating an initiative on the queen side. Instead, after the move c4, white can play queen c2, which keeps the b pawn defended and hoping to push it to b3 as a pawn break in the near future. But this is where black has a very famous strong move, bishop f5. So if you're going to play this setup, you should know this idea. Queen takes f5 fails because this is a trapped rook on a1 after queen takes b2. As a result of that, white pretty much has to play queen c1 here. And here many moves are strong for black, including the knight h5 idea again. And black has a tremendous score from this position. The computer gives black an advantage. And I think we can say that white's opening was not very successful. PSA for those who want to play this way against the London, do pay attention to your opponent's specific move order, because sometimes a little difference can make a huge difference. I'm going to show you an example right now. I once had black about 10 years ago in this position, and my opponent played queen c2 first. So not queen b3, then queen c2, but queen c2 immediately. And I thought, well, no big deal. I'm just going to go bishop f5 again, knowing that he still can't take my bishop because his rook gets trapped. And that much is true. But instead, my opponent surprised me by playing d takes c5. And the game continued with bishop takes c2, takes on b6, then knight a3. And I was a bit worse for a while. This knight was going to jump into b5, my bishop is hanging. And even though I ended up winning the game way later, it had nothing to do with the opening. The opening was definitely not a success for me. So let's find something better. Let's go back. After queen c2, which is probably the best move in the position, I would recommend one of two things. Either g6, intending bishop g7 and maybe bishop f5 in some cases, or, once again, knight h5. And yeah, there is some theory here, but I do think that with best play, black is definitely equalizing. Okay, two more little things to cover with the classical, and then we'll move on to our next setup. One is that there's a more modern approach where white holds off on c3 and instead plays knight bd2 in this position. And queen b6 is definitely still a good move, but in this case, white is intending to take on c5. And that leads to some well-trodden theory after queen takes b2, rook b1, and queen c3. So if you want, you could invest some time into learning how to equalize here, or you could choose another approach in this position. And there are many of them, including e6 and c takes d4, both of which, by the way, transpose into setups that you'll see later in this video. But there are also independent lines such as bishop g4 followed by e6. And in this instance, for example, I don't think black has too much to fear because black achieves adequate piece activity without any big weaknesses. Finally, I'll just kind of quickly mention the two bishop f4 move order. Here black has the option to play knight f6 or c5, and both of them can reach the classical I kind of like c5 first, even though it does allow a rare sharp option for white with e4 that you need to know about. But it's nothing dangerous at all with just a little bit of homework. So let's go for the main line, e3, knight c6. And now knight f3 allows us to transpose into positions we've already seen with knight f6. But what if white plays c3, completing the triangle before developing any knights? What do we do? One option is to play knight f6, leading to positions similar to those we've looked at already. But another option is to play queen b6 now, which tends to be a good idea whenever white has played c3 with the knight still on b1. At least that's something I've noticed from analyzing this opening. And if white goes for the same response shown earlier with queen b3, c4, and then queen c2, there is one little detail. Bishop f5 doesn't quite work here because of queen takes f5, queen takes b2, queen takes d5, queen takes a1, and then queen b5. This is the key move. White is threatening queen takes b7, and then if black does something about that, for example, castling queenside, then bishop takes c4 gives the queen on a1 a pretty hard time escaping. So instead, in this particular case, black can throw away a pawn first with e5. And only then, after white takes it, doesn't matter how, black is ready to play bishop f5. And this time, white's got to play queen c1. And there's all kinds of fun stuff that can happen here. The main move is actually g5, trying to deflect this bishop from defending the e-pawn. And then if bishop g3, h5, and black has loads of compensation, and I think a lot of players would really enjoy playing these lines. But anyway, that's it for the classical, which is perhaps black's most reputable path to equality against the London system. My second idea against the London is a very close relative of the classical, and so it's not going to take a whole lot of time to present. It's basically the exact same setup, but with one little difference. We reach a position like this, which we've already seen through the classical setup, but we throw in this one little exchange, c takes d4. And white typically recaptures with e takes d4 to keep a pawn in the center, and this leads to a Carlsbad pawn structure, which is why I call this the Carlsbad setup. And it shares some themes with the variations we've already seen, but it also has a bit of its own character. Now, if you're a Queen's Gambit player, especially from the white side, or if you've played the Caro-Kann defense, something like that, even some lines of the Slav, you probably are very familiar with the Carlsbad pawn structure. But I just want to share a few general ideas with no pieces on the board to talk about what both sides' plans are. And I'm going to start with the important designation of the open E-file side and the open C-file side. In every Carlsbad, there's always going to be an open E-file side, which in this case is white, and an open C-file side, which in this case is black. And that side also happens to have two center pawns. Structurally speaking, there are two long-term plans for the open C-file side with the two center pawns. One of them is the b4 break. That's the famous minority attack, b5, b4, trying to create a weakness on the queen side. And the other one, which is riskier, usually takes a while, but certainly still a serious idea, is f6, and at the right moment, e5. Now, which of these plans you go for depends a ton on the exact position, and you can't really decide before the game, hey, I'm going to use this plan, hey, I'm going to use that one. But just as these ideas happen so often in the Queen's Gambit Decline version of the Carlsbad, they're also very relevant here. So let's see it in action. Let's say d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, c5, e3. All of this we've seen before, but now we're going to throw in this trade on d4, and only at this point do we play knight to c6. This is a normal start for the Carlsbad setup against the London, and the next plan is going to be to develop this bishop from c8. So for example, if white plays bishop d3, that allows black to play bishop g4 with e6 next, and then you can develop the dark bishop soon. And if white plays c3 instead, then black can play bishop to f5. And we're never afraid of this trade on d3, because that was white's good bishop after all. And one way to play, not the only way but the safest way, is actually to trade the other pair of bishops as well, with e6 and then bishop to d6. And after that exchange, we get a pretty quiet position. White is definitely not better, and black can think about the minority attack. It's pretty peaceful with some chances to play for a win if you're a skilled positional player. A master playing white would probably not allow black to get such an easy life, and would probably try to put a little bit more pressure on. For example, with queen b3 attacking the b7 pawn. And although it might look a bit awkward, black is known to get a fine position with queen c8. Let's say knight bd2, and now two options. One is h6 to preserve the bishop, or black can just play e6, which allows knight h4, and bishop e4 is a main line with some dynamic play, where black can take back with either the knight or even the pawn on e4, which creates some imbalances. One more thing to mention is that if, let's say, black goes e6 and white doesn't play knight h4, black has this strange-looking maneuver, bishop e7 to d8 to c7. And this diffuses white's pressure because once you trade off these bishops, black will be ready to play rook b8 and go for the minority attack in the middle game. Last thing about the Carlsbad, just like in the classical, white's move order with 2 bishop f4 actually gives us some additional options. So after c5, e3, the trade on d4, then knight c6, you might notice that black has not blocked the f-pawn. Black hasn't played knight f6 yet, and this gives black ideas. One of them is c3, f6, a very strange move, trying to push e5, sometimes even g5. Or black can do a more restrained approach with bishop f5, then e6, and instead of putting the knight on f6, black can play bishop d6 and then knight g to e7, creating the option one day to go for the f6 e5 plan mentioned previously. So the Carlsbad is a great option against 2 bishop f4, and certainly a strong choice against the London in general. Now we come to my third recommendation against the London, which is the one I've personally used the most often in my own tournament games. I call it the universal because it can be reached so many different ways, but at its core, it's basically a setup where black goes for d5, knight f6, e6, c5, and usually knight c6, but not always, in some order, many different move orders. Let me give you some examples. First of all, if you're a d5 player, you can use the same move orders we've seen. d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, and here you have a choice. You could play c5, or you could play e6 and then c5. And you've reached the universal, whether you play e6 here or on the next turn. Here's another. Let's say you're a Nimzo Indian player. This is perfect for you. You can go d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, and then as soon as white plays bishop f4, you know you're in a London. Now you can play d5 with c5 next. You could even reach this system with e6 on move 1 as well, provided that you're willing to play the French defense. Now, at first glance, you might be wondering, why is black blocking in the bishop on c8 by playing e6 in the universal setup? I think that's a very good question. That was one of my reactions when I first saw these positions. I thought that white must be better, because both of white's bishops are going to get in the game quickly, whereas black's bishop on c8 probably won't participate for a while. Over time, I've realized it's not as simple as that because, first of all, very often in this opening, black plays knight h5 to win the bishop pair. So eventually, once that bishop on c8 does get into the game, it might help black win. As the board opens up, black will have the two bishops in some of these lines. That's one reason. But something else I want to show you. I'm just going to go all the way back to move 1 and switch colors, and we're going to have the white pieces for a moment and play down a mainline Slav defense. And we reach a variation called the shallop variation, or the slow Slav is also what some people call it. And we get to a position which I've actually played quite often as white. And it turns out that this is just about the exact reverse of the universal setup against the London. And this is a mainline opening that many grandmasters have played as white. And a lot of the ideas here that white goes for, whether it's queen b3 or bishop d3 or even knight h4 to try to win the bishop pair, all of these are very common ideas in the universal against the London. So the logic goes that if this position is a pretty reasonable way for white to play against these quiet lines in the Slav, then it should also be a reasonable way for black to play with colors reversed. One additional reason I call this the universal is because there are so many different ways to play within it. And I'll show some of them now. Let's say we get this position, and white goes with the main move c3. Black goes knight c6. Now bishop d3 by white is not so accurate because either queen b6 right away, or you could actually combine the two ideas. You could go knight h5 first, and then bishop g5, queen b6. This is quite strong for black, and the point is that white's queen b3 move is met by c4. And this forces that favorable endgame structure we saw earlier, and black is known to be better in this case. So instead, let's say queen c2, and you can go all out to win the bishop pair, h6, g5, then you take on g3. And this might look a little risky, but black is already a good bit better, for example with this move, g4. Instead, what if white plays knight bd2 first before developing the late bishop? That's the main move, and this is where black has many different options. One option is that black can play bishop d6. That's one of the main lines. And here typically white plays bishop g3, keeping the tension and hoping that black will take, opening the h-file for white's rook. And there's a lot of theory here, and it's all fine for black. You could definitely go for this one, but it's actually not something I've personally played very often. Another idea for black is to play the simple bishop e7. And what's nice about this move is that you sort of have a positional threat. Not really, but kinda, because if white plays bishop d3, black can play knight h5. And this wins the bishop pair because by playing bishop e7 earlier, you took away the option of bishop to g5. Now that's not a big problem for white or anything to lose the bishop pair in a pretty close position, but some strong players prefer to avoid that as white. So they might go for a move like h3, which intends to meet knight h5 with bishop h2. Knight h5 would not make much sense. So instead, black has a funny response. Black loses a tempo and now plays bishop d6. Because since white has played h3, there's no longer the response bishop g3 that we saw earlier. Bishop g3 would be met by bishop takes g3, f takes. This is a really ugly structure for white. After bishop d6, white has a few options, including knight e5, bishop takes d6, or the main line in the Grandmaster games, d takes c5. But it's all perfectly fine for black with best play. In those Slav lines that I mentioned earlier, white was often playing knight h4 to try to win the bishop pair and grind out a slight advantage, and it so happens that knight h5 in these universal setup positions is a very trendy idea for black. There are several ways you can do it. About a decade ago, it was always c takes d4 and then knight h5, and that's been analyzed to death, and black is fine there. But also, since then, the immediate knight h5 has gained in popularity too. And this is where I would personally look if I wanted to play this setup nowadays. The main move is bishop g5, And then you get f6, bishop h4, g6. We don't want to have any tactical problems with this knight on h5. And next is bishop d3, c takes d4. E takes d4 runs into knight f4, which attacks the bishop and the g-pawn, so that's a bit awkward for white. White should probably take with the c-pawn instead, after which black goes bishop d6 and castles. So this type of position you would get often if you play knight h5 in that line, and with some preparation, black will eventually push g5 and finally trade the knight for this bishop once it goes to g3. And sometimes afterwards you can generate kingside attacking chances. And another idea is to play for e5. So a very rich position, often a bit of a messy position, but some of you guys may like that because it creates imbalances that you can use to play for a win. There are even more ways to play the universal than just this. Just to show one last idea, you can play bishop d6 without knight c6 in some lines. For example, here, you get this position, bishop d6. White does have a lot of different responses. There's knight e5, there's bishop takes d6, and also white could ignore the tension with bishop d3 or knight bd2. So lots to learn. But let's say that white plays bishop g3 here, the default reply to bishop to d6. Black castles, then plays c5, queen c7, and then not knight c6, but knight bd7, intending to push e5. This is the point. So if white castles, now and only now, black may take on g3, because we're not scared of the h-file opening anymore. And then you can play e5, or a few other moves, with a known equal position. I used to play this way as black, and it does take some work, but you could argue it's worth it. I don't think white really has any path to an advantage against this way of playing. So lots of different ways within the universal. There's kind of something for everyone, ranging from very solid approaches like this to weirder, wilder ones, but there are definitely going to be chances for both sides. At this point in the video, if you're a King's Indian player or a Grunfeld player, or just generally someone who doesn't play d4, d5 as black, you're probably getting impatient. But don't worry, I got you. Got 2 setups left. And this first one I call the Grunfeld because it ends up looking very much like a Grunfeld. And it can even transpose into one in some cases. So in this one, we're playing in some order d5, knight f6, g6, bishop g7, and c5. Also, we'll castle kingside. This is a little bit like the universal in the sense that it can be reached in many ways. And another thing you might notice is that it resembles a Catalan opening, which makes sense because the Catalan and the Grunfeld are somewhat related. And if you have experience with either of those openings, then you should be at home here. d4, d5 players can definitely play this setup. You'll just be going knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4, g6, followed by bishop g7 and c5. But d4, knight f6 players can reach it too. Say d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, and now bishop f4. You could play bishop g7 first, but you can also play d5. One important note though, for the King's Indian player and also for the Grunfeld player, sometimes opponents with white may switch to a Jobava style approach, and I'll show you how they might do that. After d4, knight f6, bishop f4 first, g6, here knight c3 is a pretty common move order these days. And I said I would not focus too much on the Jobava in this video, but I think in this instance I kind of have to. This is something you're going to have to learn a bit about, so I'll make this quick, but let me just briefly dispatch with these variations. If you don't want white to push e4 here, which would transpose into 1e4 territory, then you'll have to play d5. And this is where there's some specific theory to these lines. If queen d2, you can play bishop g7 and castles. Couple notes, don't be afraid of them attacking you because you are ready to blast open the center with c5 at a moment's notice. For instance, let's say bishop takes, king takes, castles long, and c5 is known to be good for black. And another setup for white is with e3, bishop g7, and h4. I would stop this with h5 myself, and then castle again, followed by c5. And you might have to do more research here than what I'm just showing you now, but I don't think white has anything worrying. And actually, there's even a chance that white's king in the center could become a weakness, as black plays c takes d4 and knight c6 soon to open the board. Other than those Jobava style lines, the Grunfeld system against the London is pretty quiet. Let's say d4, knight f6, bishop f4, g6, maybe this time knight f3, d5. And now c4 actually transposes right into a line of the Grunfeld, but not one that's considered to be better for white, and I explore that in the study linked in the description. Most London players will probably play e3, bishop g7, h3 here to avoid knight h5 problems. And now after castles, bishop e2, black is ready to go with c5. So really, in every single setup that I've shown to this point in the video, c5 is central to black's play. And it's true again here. Next is going to be knight c6, white castles, and now it's time to develop the light bishop with b6, knight bd2, and bishop b7. This is a very easy system for black to play and remember. It's hard for white to throw you off. It's solid. It's straightforward. It doesn't really put that much pressure on white, but it's also hard to crack. And your next plan could be something slow like rook c8, e6, queen e7, or there's another idea. Knight d7, and then the break e5. And black has scored pretty well from here in the master games, so it's definitely a reliable way to play. Last but not least, for the King's Indian players in the audience, as well as the modern players, you can absolutely play a King's Indian style approach against the London without putting your pawn on d5 at all. You could do it with 1d6 or even 1g6, but most King's Indian players are going to start with knight f6. Now, of course, we already talked about the fact that white has bishop f4, g6, knight c3 again. And as mentioned, I do think that the best approach is to go d5 here. But if you already play the modern defense, maybe you're not bothered by white's threat to push e4 and would rather allow it by playing bishop g7. So many options. One of the great qualities of the King's Indian is its flexibility. So instead, let's suppose knight f3, g6, bishop f4, bishop g7, and now many ways the game can continue, since the center is so amorphous. That is to say, black hasn't even moved any of their center pawns, so there are all kinds of structural transformations that could happen. In the study that I've linked in the description, I go into some detail about a way that I used to play as white here actually, with c4, but it doesn't really work that well objectively, and I stopped doing it because, as is so often the case throughout this entire video, the move c5 gives black a good position, and white is falling behind in terms of king safety as the center opens up. More often, white will play bishop e2 and castle, or maybe bishop d3 as well, which doesn't change much, and black can play d6. As we've seen so often throughout this video, white can go h3 here to preserve the dark bishop, giving it a hiding spot on h2 in case of knight h5. And this is where black has all sorts of different ideas. First things first, let's look at the most common theme we've seen, the break c5. And if white plays c3, an idea all the way back from the classical setup returns. We've got queen b6 targeting the pawn on b2. And if white plays queen b3, many moves are possible. The main one is bishop e6. Black has a positive score here in the master games. As usual, we're happy to see a queen trade on b6. This just develops our rook on a8. For many King's Indian players, the default plan in most of these positions is to achieve the e5 break, and then to create some type of attack like a pawn storm on the king side. And it looks like the London is kind of designed specifically to prevent this, because you have a pawn, you have a bishop, you have a knight, all controlling e5. But in fact, you can still achieve this, and in several different ways too. Black can start here with knight c6, and now after castles, black can prepare e5 with knight d7, let's say c4, then e5. And once this bishop moves back to h2, black can indeed play f5, and this position does have some of those Martel Plata variation, pawn stormy vibes that you might have been looking for. Or another way to achieve e5 is back here on move 7, you can just play it. And white should probably play bishop h2 now, because if d takes e5, then black gets a very good position with knight e4, where the pawn on e5 is pinned against the b2 pawn, so black will get their material back soon. Finally, there are some super flexible ways you can play the King's Indian setup. The London is not a very threatening opening from white, so you often have lots of time to go about creating whatever development scheme you want for these queenside pieces, within reason, of course. And the one that's most popular among the masters is b6, then bishop b7. Sometimes white will play for a4, a5, so let's just play a6 here to meet a5 with b5. And otherwise, suppose white goes bishop h2, black can play knight bd7. And now many ideas are available here. You could go c5 next, or you can even play rook e8 or queen e8 and go for the e5 break. So the King's Indian setup is a fantastic option for those who want to make their opponent think for themselves outside of just spamming the default London system moves. Black's setup is so formless that it's very difficult for white to know where to aim their middle game play. And that is it. That was my 5 recommendations for the black pieces against the London system, and hopefully at least one of them is the right recommendation for you depending on your repertoire and your tastes and things like that. Now remember, of course, that in the link in the description you can see all of this in PGN format. You can also play around with the database, the computer, things like that. So hopefully that will be helpful for you. And it even has some additional analysis beyond what I covered in this video in certain specific lines. Believe it or not, the analysis that I just shared with you is pretty surface level. There's way deeper stuff where that came from. And if you want to learn more, or if you just want me to help you on your own chess journey, then feel free to reach out to me at my coaching profile. Will be linked in the description. We can work out a time to meet virtually. Hopefully at least one of these setups will help you. And also hopefully this is a helpful video if you play the London yourself. Maybe you learned a thing or two. Let me know which is your favorite setup. Maybe it's even something I didn't mention in this video against the London system. And that's about it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.